one of the problems with a lot of science at the moment is that we're very focused on individual studies. And you can't really conclude a lot from an individual study. What you need to do is to be trying to do cumulative science, where you have a number of studies that start pointing you in one direction or another. But if you then leave out the ones just because you think they're cluttering the literature with boredom, you will then start to form a very false idea of what is the case. This was really demonstrated. In fact, my little sort of plots and things that I did here were rather inspired by this paper that I got very excited by T Bergstrom and his colleagues, where they were sort of talking about canonization of false facts. And they were talking about exactly this kind of process, whereby if you over time accumulate evidence across a number of experiments for a particular effect or not, publication bias really messes you up. And this little sort of wonderful diagram that they've done is really just representing what I showed you before, that it depends on your alpha level, depends on the power of your study. You make a claim, it's true or it's false. But then what you've got is down here a little arrow that says if you fail to support or if you support the study, you get a probability that it won't get published at all, and you don't see it. And so that's what happens. You go through this loop and you go round and round with more and more studies, and you build up this notion that something is true because you've never seen the null evidence. So this is really quite serious. How common is it? Well, Amy showed you this plot earlier. It comes from a study by De Vries and colleagues that Marcus Manaffa was involved in. And again, it's looking at cumulative effects of reporting and citation biases. So they were able to do this study precisely because there was a trial registry for studies on depression. And so they were able to look at all the studies that had been done and what the results were as reported in the registry, regardless of whether they appeared in a journal. But what they were able to show was that if you took all the studies here, about half of them actually gave you a positive result, but that only about half of the negative results never got published. So this is publication bias in this context, whereas the ones that found a positive result, pretty well all of them got published. And then they found on top of that, there was this outcome reporting bias, which again is something that Amy mentioned, that Ben Goldacre has documented very nicely, that people may then claim that they predicted a different outcome from the one that they actually observed, so that you get negative trials here that have gone positive because they found something, even though it wasn't what they actually predicted. So you have this situation of publication bias in this literature, but bear in mind that in many fields of psychology, we don't know about all these studies that never make it from here to here. They just disappear. And so we have this impression that the literature is actually far stronger than it is for particular effects. And as if that wasn't as much of a problem as we can deal with, it does get worse still, because then you have the issue of, does your study actually get cited by other people? And what happens? Well, it's fascinating. So you get these studies that have survived to this point. They've got actually published, albeit perhaps with some spin or misrepresentation. They then get, when they get out there, there'll be some sort of, in some abstracts and things, there'll be this process of what they call spin or milespin, which are studies where the abstract actually misrepresents what's in the study, even though the body of the text doesn't. But then there's citation bias. So there is the size of these circles in this final thing represent how frequently these studies were cited in the subsequent literature. So you can see, start to feel quite sorry for these little red studies, because every time you're red, and you have a null result, first of all, you don't get published. Then if you do get published, your outcome gets switched or spun. But then even if you make it to this point, what happens is nobody cites you. So your null results disappear pretty well comprehensively from the literature. It's a very dramatic demonstration of the problem that we have in many areas of science. We are deluding ourselves, and we are creating these fake facts, and it's really, or this canonization of fake facts that Bergstrom and colleagues talk about. And then this bias gets propagated through the literature, because if I read a peer-reviewed paper, I tend to think, I read the introduction, I think, well, the citations this person cites backing up their argument are probably okay. It depends who's written the paper, of course. But then what do you do if you were writing your own paper in that area? You will be influenced by what other people have written. If you're a good scientist, you will read the papers that you're citing, but increasingly we're all terribly busy and we just rely on what somebody else said was in that paper. So you can inherit a whole sort of sense of the literature, which is very distorted. And if people only cite materials that agree with a particular viewpoint, you get this same process where a wrong viewpoint gets entrenched. And the only way you can try and find out what's really the case is to explicitly search and see if there are other papers that give a different picture. But if you try and tell people to do that, many people say, well, I don't have time to do that. We're all under such time pressure writing papers that we don't have enough time to read papers. And I think this is a massive problem. We have moved away from a model of academic scholarship where you do actually engage with the prior literature to one where you cherry pick out things that fit your views. A partial solution, and a solution that was initially sort of, again, really coming, I think, more from clinical medicine, I think, although I might be wrong on that. I think Ian Chalmers said it was from another field, systematic review. But the idea is you collect and summarise all the empirical evidence that fits a pre-specified eligibility criteria. So you're trying to really be a good scholar and look at everything that's been written before. And that should help us avoid this issue of biasing out what we put in our introductions and justifications. But it's not foolproof. I mean, for one thing, we know that the literature is distorted, so we already have publication bias. But even if we didn't have publication bias, that meant that the literature was distorted, we have bias in terms of what gets into abstracts. And when you do a systematic review, you typically don't sit down and read every paper that's ever been written before. You can't. There's often too many. So you will often start by screening titles and abstracts to see, was this particular topic mentioned? And if it's not, then you will miss studies that might have studied. I mean, for example, I talk here about associations between autism and the cerebellum. If people study the whole brain in autism and they find something about the cerebellum, they're more likely to put it in the abstract. Whereas if it was a result that was not very interesting but was nevertheless looked at, it doesn't get into the abstract. So we have this other process whereby things get left out. So it's really, really hard to be certain that we are seeing all the evidence that's relevant to a particular thing that we're investigating. So who's to blame for this situation? I think everybody's to blame for the situation. There's no one cause, but I think there are a number of processes that conspire towards it, and we're going to have to fix all of them as far as we can if we're going to improve the situation. Individual researchers, I think Amy mentioned confirmation bias, and I think, I say who's to blame. There's a sense in which we shouldn't be blamed for confirmation bias because it is a basic way of how we think. And if we didn't have confirmation bias, we'd go through life being completely overwhelmed by everything. But for sort of day-to-day activities, it's useful to sort of use your prior knowledge of something to justify what things you sort of focus on. But the real problem is in the literature is that we all do this thing of only processing and remembering information that agrees with our viewpoint. I've been guilty of this myself, and I talk about it in some of my writings. I was very, very fascinated to read. Charles Darwin had written something that I thought was very, very wise, saying that in many years he'd followed a golden rule, that whenever a published fact or a new observation or thought came across me, which was opposed to my general results, to make a memorandum of it without fail and at once, for I had found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from the memory than favourable ones. Owing to this habit, very few objections were raised against my views, which I had not at least noticed and attempted to answer. And of course, Darwin had the luxury of a private income, and he sat in his cottage writing Origin of Species and many other books and doing tons of stuff quietly and without having to worry about tenure and such like. But the point is that he's making that it's very easy to overlook things if they don't fit in. In fact, quite often those things are the more important things, or you need to at least have a way to explain them to people who are going to attack your work. So there's real benefits in sort of taking on board things that don't fit. But I thought that was I really enjoyed reading that. Well, that's a very wise observation.